Hi, I'm assuming that you have probably begun working your way through Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I want to offer you some help navigating this novel in ways that are similar to the challenges you faced when you read Housemaid of Dawn. You may face some similar challenges trying to read Hurston's novel, particularly if you are not accustomed to reading dialect in presented through dialogue. So I'm going to highlight some things about the novel that I think will be helpful to you. So I want to give you just a bit more information about Zora Neale Hurston. You can read through the slides. What I want you to understand is that she was very engaged in the Harlem Renaissance, and she was a prolific writer during the late 1930s, 40s, and into the very early 1950s. She was respected by many of her colleagues. She was also criticized heavily by other writers in the Harlem Renaissance movement, particularly some of the men. But she contributed a great body of literature to the canon of African American fiction and nonfiction. And she did grow up in the first incorporated Black community named Eatonville in Florida. So here's some information about the novel itself. Their Eyes Were Watching God was published in 1937, and not long after its publication, it went out of print and remained out of print for almost 30 years. It was rediscovered and then reissued in paperback form by the University of Illinois Press in the late 70s. Now, it is the most widely read and highly acclaimed novel in the canon of African American literature. So here are some things to keep in mind as you are reading the novel. First of all, it is organized chronologically, but it is framed by an outer scene that is similar to the movement that Mama Day used in Housemaid of Dawn. The opening chapter describes Janie returning to Eatonville after being away for a period of years. She engages with her old friend Phoebe and then launches into the story of her quest. And so the novel jumps from the fictional present back in time to her early girlhood. And then it moves chronologically until we get back to the scene with which the novel opened. The story is told primarily through three voices. The narrator's voice is fully omniscient, and it is the very poetic voice that we hear in the first few lines of the novel. We receive a lot of the story through Janie's own voice, and we get this primarily through her dialogue and internal thoughts. But then we also hear Phoebe's voice, both in the beginning and end of the story, and she functions as the receiver of the tale. Janie is the teller, the narrator is the interpreter, and Phoebe is the receiver of this story. Place contributes a great deal to the story and functions as both a character and as a background, the backdrop on which the characters live out their lives. Janie is a formidable character, and across the novel she is pursuing the object of her desire, which is the ideal perfect love. Her quest includes all of the classical elements of the heroic quest, and she is the hero figure in this story. Narrative point of view and oral storytelling. The entire novel is written using third-person point of view. The narrator's voice is fully omniscient, and of course Janie's voice is third-person limited omniscient, as is Phoebe's and any of the other characters. That gives us the great benefit of experiencing Janie intimately because we have such great access to her thoughts and her interior world, but also being able to observe her and the other characters from the outside. Because so much of the story is told through dialogue and Janie's internal thoughts, the novel has a strongly oral tradition, and that reflects, or strongly oral quality, and that reflects Hurston's interest in anthropology and folklore. The language that Hurston uses in this novel might be a little bit challenging for you, but it is beautiful. There's a high level of lyricism in the narrative, or the narrator's passages. They're very poetic. The narrator employs metaphor extensively. So the narrator's passages are examples of high art. Janie's passages, where she's in control of the narrative, are dominated by dialogue, and these passages in the novel are excellent examples of colloquialism and folk art. Hurston was also very interested in feminine identity and gender roles. So throughout the novel, we see Janie exploring definitions of things like female beauty, female strength, female independence, and female intelligence. She wrestles with these things, and of course the men who are important in her life, Logan Killix, Jodie Sparks, and Tea Cake, also wrestle with those because Janie is so engaged with these aspects of her own identity. And Janie's willing to challenge with increasing force the social norms that dictate both male and female gender roles. At the time during which the story happens in American history, men have most of the power and authority, socially, spiritually, economically, and politically. So that's another source of ongoing conflict between Janie and not only the men in her lives, but other women in the societies where she dwells. You should pay attention to imagery in the novel. There are many key images that recur multiple times. One of the first and most prominent images is the pear tree, and some of you may have an edition of the book that features a pear tree or Janie lying under a pear tree. Janie's long, beautiful hair is another key image. There's a lot of attention given to that. The horizon emerges as a strong metaphor, a metaphor for Janie's quest, a metaphor for her own identity and personal fulfillment, and a metaphor for her longings. The main street in Eatonville is a key image, and we encounter that at several points across the novel. It represents many things. It represents prosperity. It represents Black dignity and independence and mobility. It also comes to represent a lot of restriction and emotional oppression that Jamie experiences both in her marriage and within the hierarchy of Eatonville society. And then, of course, the Everglades landscape. Another element in the story that has both metaphorical and literal significance is the hurricane in the Everglades. That quite literally wreaks havoc in Janie's life, but it's also a metaphor for those forces that are working against her to try to destroy her or suppress her strength and discoveries. Janie's journey, in understanding her journey, you need to pay attention to both the geographical distances that she travels and the 3 different places where she lives for periods of time, and the psychological journey. So pay close attention to both Janie's exterior world and her movement through that world, and her interior world and the gradual transformations that she experiences. Secondly, you can pay attention to the specific obstacles or antagonists that frustrate Janie's quest for both self-actualization and perfect love. Those are the the objects of her desire. So you should pay attention to those things that frustrate that, and then Pay close attention to how she responds to each of those antagonists. Which ones seem to defeat or limit her in some ways, and which ones is she able to conquer and overcome? Finally, I want you to think about the themes that are woven through this narrative. One is romantic love. That is the great ideal that Janie is pursuing in all of her relationships. Freedom and personal autonomy is a theme, and that's relevant not just to Janie, but to some of the other women, and certainly to the men to whom she's married. Beauty and feminine sexuality are important themes. Remember, Hurston was interested in anthropology and gender roles, and so she's going to be very intentional about exploring Janie's coming of age and her burgeoning sexuality, asking questions about who and what influences her sense of self and her perceptions of herself as a sexual being. And then finally, voice. This idea of having a voice, being heard and understood clearly by others, being silenced, and the oppression that creates in a person's life. Those are some of the themes. Remember that the novel begins with this. In the beginning, we are presented with a teller and a receiver of the tale. Janie is the teller, Phoebe is the receiver. Janie has finally discovered her voice and is using that voice to pass on to Phoebe her own life story. Phoebe then is empowered to become a teller as she takes possession of that tale and recognizes her responsibility to then share it with other people. I hope that these tips are helpful to you and gives you a framework with which to explore this story.